Today we're going to talk about threshold. So, threshold is the amount of emotion, excitement, frustration, fear, etc., that an animal can feel before they start losing emotional control. This happens with humans, this happens with dogs. If we're talking about a scale, usually like 1 is very calm, essentially passed out like my guys are. They're still conscious, but they're very relaxed. And 10 is losing it. Really not able to make educated choices at that point. Usually I find about 8 is threshold. Above that point, we are not making good choices. A human example of this might be if you wake up in the morning and you stub your toe, first thing. You forget your coffee while you're on your way to work and you get stuck in traffic. And that frustration is just building and building. Maybe you have a bad day at work and you come back home and the kids need a bath, need dinner, they're crying, everything's just going haywire, and you can feel yourself starting to hit that point where you don't have as much emotional control as you want. Maybe that means that you have to go into another room and take a breath. Maybe you need to cry. Maybe you need to yell into a pillow. Everyone has different coping mechanisms, but if you feel like you are at that point, that is your threshold. Above that, that's where people tend to cry or scream, say things they don't mean, because you have lost that emotional control. Dogs have that too. So ideally with dog training, we want to keep our dogs below that threshold. Sometimes that's not possible. If you have a really reactive dog, sometimes when they see another dog, they will immediately go at or over that threshold. But at that point, when they are over threshold, that is also not when we are trying to explain things to them. They just, their brains are shut off. They are not available to take in information at that point. We're triaging. Just like you would not necessarily be trying to explain things to a toddler who is throwing a temper tantrum. Sometimes they might be able to absorb that information, but it's going to be much, much harder to get through to them. Instead, we let them simmer down, get a little bit calmer, and then we work on education. So that's what we want to work on with our dogs as well. We want to work on keeping them below that threshold of fear, overstimulation, excitement, and it goes for all different types of emotions too. It doesn't necessarily have to be negative emotions. Sometimes people get so excited that they don't process things really well. We see this with the classic really excitable happy breeds like Labradors, Golden Retrievers, where maybe they just get so excited they start bumping into people and knocking things over, where they're not being aggressive, but they've lost a little bit of that emotional control that they would normally have. So keep an eye on that with your dog. Are you noticing that they are struggling? Are they getting really overstimulated? When they hit that point, they tend to go back to their breed selected behaviors. So for bullies, they tend to grab and hold things. We have a dog who came into us who would bite other dogs when she got overstimulated. And she wasn't necessarily thinking at that point, but that was something that we had to work on. A lot of people have seen videos of people visiting and Labradors will grab a toy and they'll bring it to them. That's because they have been selected for retrieving things. Herding types tend to nip. Everyone's heard stories of herding dogs herding children when they're getting really excited. Sometimes that's an overstimulation behavior. Sometimes that's just a lack of impulse control. But that tends to be the type of behavior that we see when they hit that point. So instead, we want to play games and work with our dogs where we teach them to go up to or below that point. We don't want to necessarily encourage most dogs to go over that point. There are exceptions to the rules, but for most pet dogs, I don't necessarily want them practicing going over that threshold. So how do we work on that? We work on, again, rewarding behaviors that we like. We work on helping them to emotionally regulate. So if we're playing a game, we don't necessarily want them to go over that threshold. If they start losing the ability to properly target things, if they start biting your hand instead, or just getting really wound up and wild, we take a break in that game. So that they can decompress. When they're calmer, then we can restart. If your dog's reacting all the time on walks, maybe we work on training around the house if possible, or we go to a quieter location so that we can make it easier to train so that they're not getting triggered and over threshold all the time on those walks. Maybe we interrupt the behavior sooner. Sometimes that's not possible. Sometimes we have dogs who react immediately when they see a trigger. But if you have a dog who takes a couple of seconds when they see their trigger before they go over that threshold, Take advantage of those couple of seconds. Interrupt the behavior, use your leash, use your voice, poke them on the bum, whatever you have to do so that you can just interrupt your dog and then create the behavior that we want. Because after they start barking, lunging, or getting overwhelmed, that's really not our training point. We could correct them for that, which might teach them something, but it's very hard for them to absorb information when they are overwhelmed. It's hard to process, it's hard to absorb. So our goal with training is usually to keep them under those levels. So just keep that in mind if you find that your dog is struggling to absorb information but also tends to be very easily overwhelmed.